be able to discuss the chronological history of the Presbyterian Church of East Africa around Eastern region, we have to look at three aspects of events at the onset of Christian influence. One of these is the traditional situation into which the white man built a new Christian culture and Western civilization. The other aspect is the beginning of the church work in Kenya, without which the Christian influence could not reach this area. The last aspect is the impact of Christian influence. Before the white man set his foot into this area, there was a seer known as Mtwagachorwa. He lived a century earlier than the coming of the missionaries. Mtwagachorwa had foretold of foreign intrusion that there were to come a people with white hair and wearing skirts like clothing. He foresaw long snakes, one that is grey in color and another that is black in color, linking them with a railway line and tarmac roads. He saw people gathered like chicks in a nest, presently schools, and weak children gathered on beds like logs, presently the hospitals. He foretold of his people following the white-haired people with eagerness that is unexplainable. The country around Chogoria people lived in villages owned by families. The area was bushy with all sorts of wild animals, mostly elephants, lions, bush pigs, antelopes, hyenas, leopards and the like, just to name a few. The population was scarce, leaving large patches of unattended bushes between villages. Dying people were just thrown into the bush for hyenas to feast on. The bodies of the dead were never touched. Burying the bodies of the dead is part of the white man's culture. Ownership of land was collective, belonging to various clans. There were places set aside for public utilities and recreation called matiri. Education was carried out communally. The young men lived together in structures known as garu. Garu was also used as a form of barracks, where they were trained by elders, warlike techniques. Girls were also trained by elderly women in seclusive areas. Traditional dances were performed in the daylight by age groups. The most common dances were such as mwangu for young women, nyai for girls, kiboya for boys, audhi for young men, and dakanyo for children. The political organization was mainly arranged. Units ranged from family home to clan level. The administration was well set and young men were the security arm of the land. They defended their areas whenever there was a raid from outside or any other kind of attack. Elders played the role of legislators and executed the law as was necessary. The decision was final. Leadership pattern was father as the head of the family at home. At the village level, there was a spokesman, Mugambi, whose responsibility was to help in giving advice, making decisions and judging cases assisted by elders. Education was informal and was imparted by parents and peer groups. Boys learned from their senior peers how to look after cows and goats, naming them, and how to build houses. Girls were educated by their mothers in making mats made of reeds, madidu, baskets, jiondo, how to cook and grind gruel, ushoro. Age determined stages in growing up and was marked through rites of passage. The pattern was from babyhood, childhood, adolescence, early adulthood, and old age. One had to learn names of his ancestors backwards to about 10 grandparents. Equally important was to recognize who were one's cousins, nephews, and all members of the extended family. Learning was endless until death. This kind of education was orally passed from generation to generation. Religion of the people recognized two deities, God as Ngai and the devil known as Nkoma. Both were important for the well-being of the people and were feared. God was believed to have his habitation in high places like mountains, sacred trees, and deep forests. The devil was believed to live underground and was appeased through libation, associated with bad omen, while God was seen as a source of blessing. To God, people sacrificed a goat or a bull of one color without a spot as form of prayer when they required blessings of rain or food. To Nkoma, people sacrificed a ram, ngondu, of one color without a spot as a form of prayer when there was a calamity and the family or the community did not want the calamity to strike again. Thunder and lightning were manifestations of God's power. Famine, diseases, and earthquakes was associated with God's wrath. God was also referred to as Mwenenyaga. For healing and medical services, the missionaries met medicine men who claimed ability to heal all kinds of sicknesses. Healers and the medicine men were always invited to offer their services to patients at their own homes. They were paid in kind by giving goats or food and earned their living that way. They also practiced herbal medicine. Some other healers were also witch doctors who were highly feared in the community. There were diviners who were consulted to tell the cause of the illness or the calamity and probably what was required for the healing. And this was the situation on which our people were met by the early white men and missionaries like Dr. Arthur and Clive Ivan. The prologue. 1913 to 1921, laying the foundation. It should be noted that during the colonial times in Africa, the flag and the Bible stood next to each other. Thus, European explorers and missionaries made expeditions. The missionaries provided spiritual nourishment to the colony. So when the colonial masters partitioned their spheres of influences, the Overseas Board of Missionary Enterprises, or BME, also partitioned Kenya for different enterprises with own spheres of influence. The area around Mount Kenya was not spared. It was partitioned, and the partitioning of Mount Kenya region was demarcated as follows. Nyeri district was given to the Church of Scotland Mission. Kabare district was given to the Church Missionary Society. Embu district was given to the Methodist Mission Enterprise. Meru district was given to the Church Missionary Society. These data and records are available at the Kenya National Archives and much more at the University of Oxford Library. The governor of Kenya in 1900 was an Anglican. He skillfully gave Embu to the Church Missionary Society and in exchange gave Meru North to the Methodist Mission Enterprise. Again, he annexed Lower Meru from Kidhino River southward to Embu district. Hence, South Meru and Chuka Mwimbi became part of Embu and in extension, the Anglican missionary sphere of influence, Church Missionary Society. The Methodist Mission Enterprise took up the northern parts, the upper Meru, and the Anglicans still retained the lower parts, the southern parts of Meru. This lower part of Meru was co-joined with Embu as part of CMS spheres of influence and part of the colonial territory of Embu North. The Methodist Mission built up their mission station at Kaaga. This was the northern zone of the larger Meru. Reverend Dr. J.W. Arthur was a very zealous missionary doctor come minister with the Church of Scotland Mission. In his expedition in 1913, identified that there is a big and empty space between Fort Meru and Fort Embu that was partitioned but not been occupied by the European missions. In between the two forts, there was a Fort Naka, presently Chuka Town. He therefore applied to the Overseas Board of Missionary Enterprises in Europe to be allowed to start a mission station in these lower southern parts of Meru. This was in the year 1913. Permission was granted in the year 1915 according to KM, Kikuyu News Journal of the Kenyan Mission. The place between Kidhino and Tuchi rivers was handed over to the Church of Scotland Mission to start the missionary work and also as a sphere of influence. At that point, the Reverend Dr. J.W. Arthur applied to the Free Church of Scotland and the Church of Scotland Board of Missions to sponsor and to build a mission station in this new found zone of Chuka Mwimbi and South Meru. The name Chuka Mwimbi was commonly used in the correspondences between the Church of Scotland missionaries and the Home Church Board of Trustees on mission work. And though permission to start a new mission station in the land of Meru through Church of Scotland Mission was granted in 1915, a little work was done. The Free Church of Scotland Board of Missions was economically overstretched. They were economically incapable to sponsor any further mission work. So the mission work here in Chogoria suffered economic martial to begin. The survey. Despite lack of funds, Reverend Dr. Arthur and a compatriot named William Tite were undeterred to begin the mission station. Both were young and zealous, full of energy and oomph. And on October 1913, they made an expedition to the Chuka Mwimbi place. After a month of stay, they decided to go back home to Mutumu with good news. Powered by the report of Joshua and Caleb in the book of Numbers 13, the two made arrangements for Kikuyu and Tumutumu mission stations to send a contingent of African missionaries. These were to be the forerunners of the European missionaries. The 6 African evangelists who accompanied Reverend Dr. Arthur and William Tite were David Makumi and his wife Priscilla, Wilson Wanweru and his wife Rebecca, Samson Maingi and his wife Naomi. The 8-member team traveled to this area with one mind and one heart, to conquer and to occupy. All of them were multi-skilled in Christian evangelism, modern medicine, modern education, modern farming, and modern housekeeping. They were fluent in English, Kiswahili, and Kikuyu languages. They were comfortable in the translation and assimilation with the Ameru people. The 3 African couple gained a new common title of evangelists. They were adversely mentioned in the 3 spying trips. The 3 spying trips were made in the years 1913, 1915, and 1919. Daudi and his team of the African evangelists are further mentioned after the arrival of the missionary doctor who formally opened Chogoria Station. 1913, the first spying trip. When using the term spying, we were guided by the story of Joshua and his colleagues in the book of Numbers 13. Reverend Dr. J. M. Arthur and his compatriots did extraordinary work in this land of South Meru. Their missionary expedition laid a strong Christian foundation, as we shall learn in this story. In 1913, they did an expedition at Nkuthika in Chuka, which was the home of the paramount chief Kabangongo. This site was identified as suitable by Reverend Dr. Arthur because of the security. The provision of security by the chief's guards he recommended. Going further north, they identified another site. This was at Kiereni. The Kiereni site had more advantages for the site of a mission station. It was more favorable because there was security at the military camp called Foknaka and clean water source from a river nearby. There were full-time security guards near the site, and River Naka passed through the near site, giving mission station ample water supply. However, the missionary work refused to bear fruits. This was mainly because Chuka people had developed a cold reception to strangers. This was necessitated by the raids that were done by the people of Aembu and the Amwimbi. The Achuka people had developed a cold reception to foreigners. You can read this from the historical texts of the Chuka people by Kabeka. There are also constant raids occasioned by Embu and Kamba people. Community raiding was very common those days. So the team that went to spy in Chuka never succeeded. They went back to Tumutumu and Kikuyu mission stations for further assignments. 1915, the second spying expedition. The evangelists with oomph and great desire to see a fleet of mission stations heading north decided to make a trial visit to Meru again. They had the zeal and a burning call to start a mission station no matter what. This time, it was done to the land of the Mwimbi sub-tribe. Once again, the team left their home mission stations and went for this important assignment. They arrived in October 1915. On arrival in the lands of a Mwimbi sub-tribe, they decided to make a split. One team was led by Dr. Reverend Arthur, and the other was led by Dr. Stanley John Stight. This time, William Type is not mentioned. In his place, the story talks of Dr. Stanley John Stight as a companion of Dr. Reverend Arthur. The team that was led by Reverend Dr. Arthur went to spy on Mutindwa in the Upper Mwimbi. These are the western part of the Amwimbi sub-tribe by the slopes of Mount Kenya. The other team that was led by Dr. Stanley John Stight went to spy on Muiria, Kanywe. These are the lower parts of Mwimbi, eastern side of the Amwimbi subtribe. The place was and is gently slopy, almost flat. The place Kanywe had a swamp that was swallowing people. That's the nickname Kanywe, from the essence of drinking people. Ironically, the site today is called Kariakomo, meaning a dry swamp or a small dry lake. At that time, the chief then of the Mwimbi sub-tribe was called Chief Gaitungi. According to the records found in Oxford University, Bogori Mtuamwenda by then was a colonial tribal security officer at Fort Embu. He was made the chief in 1919 at the ending of the First World War, according to Chogoria booklet. The team at Muiria, Kanywe, tried to start a temporary mission station. With the onset of the First World War, the mission plan was disrupted. These are notes that were recorded by the late Reverend Jediel Micheu. And again, the 6 African evangelists were part of the contingent of the missionaries and the mission work. They were very instrumental in all these spying expeditions. The mission work was disrupted by the First World War. All the missionaries, including the African evangelists, returned to Kikuyu and Tumutumu stations. 1919, the third spying exploration. According to Professor Ntamburi in his book, From Mission to Church, he narrates that European missionaries, since the era of Vasco da Gama, had a great desire to visit the lands of Abyssinia, present-day Ethiopia. And with the new wave after David Livingstone, there seems a renewing energy to plant mission stations northwards towards Abyssinia. Again, records report that 3 European missionaries, namely William Tyte, Dr. Stanley E. Jones, and Mr. Muti, together with the 6 African evangelists, made a third expedition to our land. This time, it is after the end of the First World War. The Reverend Dr. J.W. Arthur is not mentioned in the team that left Kikuyu and Tumutumu in October 1990. Some historians argue that he was briefly left at Kikuyu Mission Station attending to more sensitive matters, since it was just after the end of the First War. The mission work was so much affected by the World War, and it was so much needed to restore the work. This time, the present site of Chogoria won the reason due to several advantages, and this included 1. Hospitality of the people around Chogoria. Chogoria people are known to be more hospitable. Dr. Wilkinson calls it amused tolerance. 2. The waterfall at Kamara River to generate electric power for the mission station. 3. Serenity of the climate because of the proximity of Mount Kenya forest. 4. The paramount chief Bogori Wamwenda was so willing to settle the visitors and to offer security for the mission station from any unforeseen external and internal aggression. He actually gone to meet them at Fort Embu. He came with them and housed them at Mutindwa for some time. Then, on reporting back the progress to Reverend Dr. Arthur about the breakthrough on the site at Chogoria, he decided to visit the site in mid-1920. On his official visit as the lead champion for a fleet of missions heading north to Abyssinia, Reverend Dr. Arthur summed up the choice of the area with awesome inscriptions. He called the place a beautiful green sward. He also planted a wooden plaque, though now not existing, with inscription on John chapter 1 verse 1 to 5 that now there is light. Daudi Makumi, Wilson Waweru, Samson Maingi, and their spouses were great evangelists. Daudi and Wilson were teachers, evangelists station, and were students of Clement Scott. Samson was a hospital assistant, evangelist, and student of Dr. Philip and Henry Scott. Their spouses were specialists in nutrition and housekeeping. Persons of interest. The 6 Africans. Daudi, Wilson, Samson, and their wives were great evangelists and the missionaries of the time. They had a deep call to make the gospel of Jesus Christ known, and the church was blessed to have the 6. They had a burning desire to see a mission station started at Chuka Mwimbi and South Meru. They constantly pushed the European mission not to give up on the call to have a fleet of mission stations until it reaches in Abyssinia. The Daudis and the Wilsons were from Kikuyu Mission Station and were students of Clement Scott. They were teacher come evangelists. The Samsons were from Tumutumu Mission Station and were students of Dr. Philip and Henry Scott. They were hospital assistants come evangelists. A story is narrated by Dr. John Wilkinson, who took over Chogoria Hospital after the retirement of Dr. Clive Ivan, that in 1919, the 3 couples built a semi-permanent classroom in Moria, that they had enrolled 60 boys and 15 girls, that they were giving Christian catechism and technical instructions, that the school lasted for 3 months and was closed down by the provincial commissioner of the Kenya province, central Kenya around Mount Kenya. The reason was that they were closing their camp, substation at Chuka, because of the shortage of administrative staff. Sir Ernest Carr. This was one of the greatest gifts that God has ever donated to Chogoria and by large PCA Eastern region. He was a generous benefactor at a time that Chogoria Mission, call it Chuka Mwimbi Mission, had failed to start thrice. God brought this man and his family to lay a strong foundation for the gospel of Jesus Christ through the Church of Scotland Mission. He was not a Presbyterian nor from Scotland. He was a Quaker turned Anglican from Britain. He was born in a family that was established in business. From the advice of his brothers, he moved from biscuits to jam manufacturing company. He relocated his family from England to Nairobi, Kenya in 1920. He had 5 children, a son and 4 daughters. One of the daughters was Margaret Joyce, who was later to be married to Dr. Clive Ivan. In Nairobi, he settled at Woodley and was a prosperous businessman in jam and car manufacturing industry, well known as Car Company. The family learned through a periodical newsletter of Tumutumu Mission on the revival, the life of faith. They desired to know more. As they were inquiring, they learned that the work that was started by Makumi, Waweru, and Samson together with their wives had refused to pick up altogether despite spirited efforts put on. So this family offered to become the benefactor for a short period of time and see to it that a strong foundation is put in place. Chogoria at 100 years, we are more than grateful to this family. They will live in our hearts and records. In 1921, Ernest Carr and a referral barrow drove from Nairobi to Chogoria. They stayed in Chogoria drawing all the necessary strategies and plans for the mission center. And that is when Ernest Carr learned that there is an age set that has gone through the initiation, circumcision ceremony, and was nicknamed Sirigwa. Through misspelling, he called the place Chogoria. They negotiated with landowners in the presence of government officers, and the landowners were compensated and the agreement signed legally. In 1922, the team led by Ernest Carr elected the bungalow and offered to support the beginning of the mission work through finances and goodwill. Dr. John Wilkinson's words were, "Chogoria mission started small, but the mind was big. The mind kept growing better and better. Chogoria is a better place." The history committee continued with the statement of Dr. Wilkinson, and in the next century, Chogoria's focus is to glow and to grow to the best and beautiful place. Reverend John William Arthur OBE DD MD in 1881 to 1952. The Church of Scotland Mission sent J.W. Arthur OBE 1881 to 1952 Edinburgh, Scotland to work as a missionary doctor and minister of the gospel of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ in the British East Africa colony, Kenya. He served from 1907 to 1937 and was so instrumental in laying the foundation of the gospel. He was known simply as Dr. Arthur to generations of the local people. He will be remembered to have started Church of the Torch, Togoto, Chogoria Mission Church and Nakuru Church. He explored the land of Meru and worked very hard to see to it that the mission station is established. He did a lot of survey work, negotiated with the locals for Chogoria land, supervised that Dr. Ivan and the African evangelists are settled, did a lot to see to it that catechumen are baptized, become communicants, Holy Communion is celebrated regularly, the first wattle and mud church is erected in 1923. The mud and water church is replaced by the brick church building. The school is erected. The water supply and power is enough. Interestingly, he performed a surgery on Mzee Jomo Kenyatta, who was his student at Kikuyu Mission Station then. The operation was conducted at Chogoria Mission. At that time, Kenyatta was known as Johnston Kamau. This thrilled Kiambati. Kiambati was later to be baptized Johnston Kiambati, the name of his model. Reverend Dr. Clive Ivan, OBE, and Margaret Joyce Ivan. Reverend Dr. Clive Ivan was born in Liverpool, Scotland in 1893, being the eldest son of Reverend John Archibald Ivan and Lillian John. He was educated at Birkenhead School and Aberdeen Grammar School up to his secondary education. He entered Aberdeen University in 1910, graduating MA in 1913. 4 years later, in 1917, he again graduated with Bachelors of Medicine and Surgery as a medical doctor when he was only 24 years. After graduation, he was commissioned in the Royal Army Corps for military service and traveled widely and into East Africa. This was during the First World War. During his early days in East Africa, Tanganyika, he also visited several other places including the Church of Scotland Mission Station at Kikuyu, Kenya. After the war, he chose to remain and work in East Africa as a missionary doctor and preferred Kikuyu. On 19 July 1919, the Church of Scotland Mission posted him to Tumutumu Mission Hospital in Nyeri to assist Dr. Philip as a medical doctor. He did not object. He served in Tumutumu for a few months and proved to be faithful. Dr. Clive Evan was married to Margaret Joyce Carr on Friday 6 May 1921 in All Saints Cathedral, Nairobi. After their marriage, they offered to work in Chogoria Station, which was being founded by Sir Ernest Carr and his companions. They put their request to the Church of Scotland Foreign Mission Committee and were offered the job. On Monday 9th October 1922, the Ivans arrived in Chogoria. Soon after, they were joined by more African staff that had been trained at Kikuyu and Tumutumu. This included the 6 African evangelists Suleiman Naju, Paulo Wahoro, and Ayub Nguaya, among others. On his arrival, he planted a mururi tree. Reverend Dr. Clive Ivan and his wife Margaret worked in Chogoria Mission for 40 years until they retired in December 1961 and settled in Nairobi. They were blessed with 3 sons, Kenneth, Tony, and Geoffrey. Dr. Ivan worked very devotedly in this area as a medical doctor, a church minister, a teacher, and an engineer, and much more. He was a friend of the Meru people who nicknamed him Rigatiri, Doctor. He had a long, special, and faithful career of medical and missionary service in Meru as a whole. Alongside medical services at Chogoria Hospital, Tharaka area, and dispensaries, he used to perform and celebrate Holy Communion in places as far as Kajiambao in Tharaka, Mukuuni in Chuka, Ithimbari, Lower Chure, and Kanyakine. Dr. Clive Ivan died in Nairobi on 6th June 1974, aged 81 years. His remains were brought to Chogoria, his favorite place for burial, at the memorial monument he had erected in 1940 in the memory of his father-in-law, Sir Ernest Carr. Margaret Joyce Ivan died in England at Warwick on 20th May 1980. Her ashes were brought to Chogoria and buried next to her husband's grave in the memorial monument. We remember Margaret Joyce's mom as always supportive and praying. She made Dr. Clive Ivan a great man of God. The beginning of this church. The Presbyterian Church of East Africa, which succeeded the Church of Scotland Mission, did not come in isolation. It was on 3rd January 1844 when the first missionary, J. Ludwig Raff, who was a German pastor of the Church Missionary Society, accompanied by several other explorers, arrived in Mombasa. They then established their first base in Mombasa Island, with the aim of getting into the interior of Kenya. Later, another station was opened at Rabai in the mainland near Mombasa Island. Dr. James T. Stewart of the Free Church of Scotland reached Kibwezi on 1891 and set a temporary campsite. At Kibwezi, the Kamba chief Kilunda assisted them to acquire land as he was friendly to the missionaries. Health-wise, Kibwezi was not suitable due to frequent outbreak of malaria and other diseases which claimed many lives. From here, the party explored for a more suitable site in the interior to open a permanent station. Thomas Watson and Dr. Matthew Wilson reached Dagoretti in Nairobi in 1895, where a military camp, Fort Dagoretti, had been built by the British Army. They then established a mission center next to the Fort Dagoretti at a place called Kikuyu. Here, the climatical conditions were better than that of Kibwezi, and the center was expanded as a permanent base. On 1st January 1907, the Church of Scotland moved the Kibwezi center to Kikuyu. The Kikuyu Mission. Dr. Thomas Homer and Thomas Wharton of the Church of Scotland Missionary, CSM, founded Kikuyu Mission Station near Dagoretti, whose responsibility the Church of Scotland assumed on 1st January 1903. The final legal documents for transfer were ready on 9th May 1907, after which the church assumed permanent responsibility of the center at Kikuyu. Clement Scott had been appointed superintendent of the mission in 1901, and after his death on 13th October 1907, Dr. Henry Scott succeeded him. In 1908, Dr. Henry Scott opened up a missionary site at Tumutumu in Nyeri district and was looking for a more suitable site to expand the mission towards Ethiopia through Meru, the Tumutumu Mission. In 1908, Tumutumu Mission Station was started and the legal documents were made available immediately. Of the first African members of working staff at Tumutumu Mission were Petro Mugo and Daniel Washira, who had worked in Kikuyu before. In July 1909, Arthur Barrow arrived at Tumutumu and took charge for the center. He was shortly joined by Dr. Horace Phillip in April 1910 to assist in medical work, which was increasingly on a daily basis. Tumutumu Mission progressed steadily under Barrow and Phillip. Around 1912, Dr. Phillip started to train African medical assistants. From Tumutumu, the missionaries under the Church of Scotland Mission extended into Meru district following the original plan and set foot in Chuka in 1913. The process of creating a fleet of mission stations from south to north was too high. The Church of Scotland had tried at Kibwezi but had failed because of mosquitoes. They moved to Kikuyu and the environment was favorable. They extended north to Tumutumu and the environment was also good. Now it was a moment to continue north until they reached the land of Prester John. Prester John was a great friend and partner of Europe. His homeland was Abyssinia, Ethiopia. Even Vasco da Gama expeditionary journey from Lisbon through West African coast, South African coast, East African coast on his way to India was to step his feet at the land of Professor Prester John, Abyssinia. You can read this in the book From Mission to Church by Professor Zablon Ntamburi. Reverend Dr. Arthur of Kikuyu Mission Station picked up the vision of his predecessors. He, as zealous and focused, the young medical clergy missionary. The blaze that was started by Vasco da Gama, David Livingstone, Thomas Watson, Henry Scott and others got kindled, and there was no turning back. The mission station had to be started no matter what. The Chogoria Mission. The earlier area of operation for the Church of Scotland Mission in Meru district was composed of the area between Tuchi River in the south and Kidino River in the north. As we celebrate 100 years after the arrival of Dr. Clive Evan, the pioneer missionary who arrived in Chogoria in 1922, the area of operation had extended from Tuchi River in the south to Moyale district through Marsabit and Isiolo in the north. There was also the mission work at Timau, Meru and Maua. That area was under the jurisdiction of three presbyteries of Chuka, Chogoria and Imenti. Chuka Presbytery extended from Tuchi River to Tungu River. Chogoria Presbytery had extended from Tungu River to Mutonga River, both in Tharaka-Nithi district, and Imenti Presbytery from Mutonga River, covering Meru, Nyambene, Isiolo, and Marsabit district. Later in 2004, the three old presbyteries had grown in population and called for more presbyteries to be formed. Chuka Presbytery gave birth to Chuka and Magumoni Presbyteries. Chogoria gave birth to Chogoria North, South, and Central Presbyteries. Imenti gave birth to Imenti North, Central, and South Presbyteries. Later on, in 2012, Chogoria Central gave birth to Chogoria Central and West Presbyteries. After the subdivision of the First Presbytery of Chogoria, the area continued to be under the jurisdiction of the respective presbyteries that were created as the church continued to grow. By 2003, most of the mission areas between Tuchi River and Moyale Marsabit counties were taken over by the Mission Board of the PCA General Assembly and shared among other presbyteries of the PCA that did not have mission areas for administrative, spiritual, financial, and personnel supports. Such presbyteries are Nyeri Hill, Nyeri, Nanyuki, and Tumutumu. And as the areas continue to grow, some of these stations continue to revert back to various presbyteries within this region. Currently, Chogoria Mission has 9 presbyteries covering Tharaka Nithi and Meru counties. These are Magumoni, Chuka, Chogoria South, Chogoria West, Chogoria Central, Chogoria North, Imenti South, Imenti Central, and Imenti North. The expansive land of Tharaka is subdivided among the jurisdiction of Magumoni, Chogoria Central, Nyeri, Imenti South, and Imenti Central. The areas of Tigania and Igembe, Nyambene, are under Imenti North Presbytery. The area of Isiolo County is under Nanyuki Presbytery, while the area of Marsabit and Moyale counties is under Tumutumu Presbytery. Chogoria. Themes and theories. Different people of different seasons who lived in different eras have made arguments about the name Chogoria, the meaning and the origin. 1. Chogoria the place. According to the KN Kikuyu News, a journal by the Kenya Mission of the Free Church of Scotland that was published in the years of 1908 to 1958, Chogoria the place was declared as a beautiful green sward by Reverend Dr. John William Arthur. Indeed, Chogoria is a very beautiful place to visit and live. The place is about 160 miles north of Nairobi, situated about 2 miles down below the home of the senior paramount Chief Mbogori Mwenda, and also situated about 5,000 feet above sea level on the eastern slope of Mount Kenya Forest. 2. Chogoria the name. This name is very famous and popular. It is internationally known. But the interesting part to note is that Chogoria is not a name in the traditional language of the Amwimbi people, neither is it a Marian name. According to J.T. Stephen, in his book entitled In the Shadows of Mount Kenya, 1993, on page 27, the name Chogoria emanated with Sir Ernest Carr. The writer of this history booklet had access to some of the documents and correspondences about the starting of Chogoria. Reverend Dr. J.W. Arthur was the man who kindled the blaze that was fulfilled by Sir Ernest Carr. This man, E. Carr, had a misspell of the term Sirigwa, so the word Chogoria emanated from the Kimwimbi word Sirigwa. Sirigwa had 2 meanings then. According to J.T. Stevens, the first meaning of the term Sirigwa was a place where the boys were housed after circumcision initiation. There were only 2 Sirigwa centers in Mwimbi, where the initiated boys were housed for a period of 1 month. One center was at Chogoria and the other was at Kidhitu, Lower Mwimbi. The second meaning of the term Sirigwa was a name that was given to the age group of the boys that were initiated at Chogoria in 1921. The period under this age grade coincided with the period that Sir Ernest Carr was in Chogoria to rekindle the Christian missionary work as was requested by the Free Church of Scotland, and he therefore named this place Chogoria from the word Sirigwa. The ground was broken. The matter to revive the vision of the fleet of mission stations arose in 1920. The government insisted on the establishment of a serious mission work in Chuka, Mwimbi, lest the previous permission be withdrawn and given to another missionary enterprise. This threat dawned on CSM of the need of seriousness. It came to the CSM as a wake-up call. In 1921, the Church of Scotland General Assembly Business Committee commissioned its Foreign Mission Committee to do the groundbreaking for Chuka Mwimbi Mission, just like Kikuyu and Tumutumu missions. The government's Native Reserves Medical Scheme provided an annual grant of £1,572 for 10 years to start a medical mission camp, MMC, at Chogoria. Mrs. Stewart of Calgrove in Scotland donated £600 per year for 20 years, and the Foreign Mission voted £100 towards starting Chuka Mwimbi MMC for 15 years. The General Assembly advertised the posts of the mission coordinator for Chuka Mwimbi. Clive and Joyce Ivan offered themselves for the service. On February 28, 1922, Clive and Joyce appeared before the Church of Scotland Foreign Mission Committee, and after the interview, they were appointed as missionaries, but to commence work on medical lines. In August 1922, Dr. Clive Ivan and Margaret Ivan signed the deed that was deposited with the government offices in Scotland and Kenya. Dr. Clive and Joyce Ivan took up the sea journey to go to Chukamwimbi after the end of their leave in Scotland to be the coordinating missionaries. Chukamwimbi Mission. Now that in 1921 the missionary doctor had been found for this mission, the question of financial support for the establishment of the mission became urgent. The foreign mission had given too little, yet there was an agreement between the mission committee and the Ivans. The matter was made worse when the government refused to release their portion of the grant to the new missionary work because of the recently introduced Native Reserves Medical Scheme. But God is very faithful. Whenever He has been called upon by His people, He is always faithful. It was at this point of government refusal to release grants for Chukamwimbi mission that the mission staff at Tumutumu decided to go on a fast. They fasted for a whole week on receiving the heartbreaking news. Immediately after the fast, Sir Ernest Carr, on a normal visit to Nyeri, he decided to get in at Tumutumu Mission. He met the staff at the church, concluding the prayers and fasting. At the altar call, he offered to become a benefactor from God. His coming was a true and divine intervention. He offered to guarantee the sum of £1,000 annually from 1922 to 1928 to enable the work to go forward on both medical and educational lines. Thus, the Foreign Committee laid down some conditions, and one of them was to source local support in terms of human and materials so that the mission will be able to run so smoothly, because sourcing for expatriates will turn out slightly expensive. In February 1922, Sir Ika, Reverend Dr. Arthur and Sir Balo, together with the government officers from Embu, took a journey to Chukamwimbi to decide where the mission should be located. The previous three sites were not conducive: Nkuthika, Kioreni and Muiria. The team preferred Chogoria. They negotiated with the landowners in the presence of the Provincial Commission. The owners were paid, and all of them relocated their homesteads to other places of choice. Ernest Carr renegotiated with the government for a lease of the plot estimated to be 40 acres for the new mission. Carr and Balo returned to Chogoria on 5th of March 1922, and they prepared a survey of the new plot, which had to be in two parts to avoid destructions of homesteads and gardens which were present on it before those owners relocated. The next question was that of accommodation for the missionary doctor and his family. To meet this need, Carr had a wooden and corrugated iron bungalow in Nairobi. The team went to Nairobi Woodlands to pick the prefabricated bungalow. It was carried in sections by a convoy of 72 ox carts. The 146-mile journey of this convoy was undertaken in late March 1922. In the middle of the long rains, it took along narrow cart tracks and over many rickety wooden ridges, some of which were damaged by the heavy ox carts. This convoy was followed by 6 motor cars containing Carr, Balo and other Europeans for the purpose of survey. There were also Indian carpenters whose task was to erect the new bungalow. Carr and Balo camped in Chogoria for 2 weeks, ensuring the site was well set and the bungalow building was commenced. They later returned to supervise the completion of the building, ensuring that the new missionary family will be comfortable on arrival. The arrival of the missionary doctor. Dr. Clive Ivan and family arrived by ship at Mombasa on 27 September 1922 and took a train to Nairobi. They stayed at his father-in-law for a few days. On 9th October 1922 at 5:30 a.m. they set off for Chogoria in an open Dodge motorcar. They arrived at 5:30 p.m. in the evening and spent the night in the bungalow. 3 days later, their household goods arrived from Tumutumu. He sent for African staff at Tumutumu and Kikuyu Mission to come and assist him to begin the mission work. Daudi and Priscilla were the first to arrive on 15th October, and the family of Daudi arrived on 20th October 1922. And because there was no house for them, they were hosted by Dr. Ivan's family, with the assistance of Chief Mbogori, who instructed strong men and women to volunteer themselves to build the mission. The bushy Chogoria Ridge was cleared and more staff houses were built. More staff arrived within the period of time. On 27th October, the families of Wilson and Samson arrived, and on 30th October, 2 hospital assistants and 1 carpenter arrived. Hospital assistants were Suleiman Nanju and Paulo Wahoro, while Ayub Nguya was the carpenter. In January 1923, 2 teachers, 1 hospital assistant, and a stone mason named Maina arrived from Tumutumu. This team started to transform the area. Many students from Chuka, Mudambi, Mwimbi, Igoji, and Imenti were enrolled on technical education, and by June 1923, the class had reached 160 students. These students freely offered themselves to build the mission station and the stations that accompany it. They constructed the site at the waterfall where the power would be generated from. They constructed the hospital, they constructed the classrooms, and lastly, they constructed the first church. In February 1924, Sir Ernest Carr donated a small hydroelectric 20 kilowatt DC generator. It was installed and the whole mission was lit with light. It was a beautiful place at night. The new scene attracted many local people to the new mission station, and the mission experienced a lot of growth. As growth of the mission continued, a furrow had to be made from the South Mara River to increase amount of water in the Kamara River. A new 2.5 horsepower Pelton wheel-run generator was again ordered and installed. With the availability of enough electricity and more water supply, an industrial workshop was built. The workshop involved splitting of timber, making of bricks, and developing of the modern infrastructure. Many classrooms were built to teach boys and girls arithmetic form of learning up to nursing level. The modern church was enabled and modern structured hospital was constructed. There were power-driven machines such as grindstone, sand crusher, sifter, clay mixer, and electric planes. With the growth of education, Bibles were brought at Chogoria for people to read. Films were brought in to make people understand Christianity deeper. Storybooks were sourced to help the community learn about new life. Many missionaries also wrote short stories. Dr. Clive Ivan wrote several books including Telephone to Heaven, Guide to Prayers, and Good Table Manners. Notables. The Monument. In 1940, Reverend Dr. Clive Ivan decided to honor his father-in-law, Ernest Carr, by erecting a memorial monument. The memorial was to remember the material and moral contributions from Sir Ernest Carr, who had agreed to fund the missionary and hospital expenses in Chogoria for 7 years when the mission center was founded. The memorial was erected using locally made materials, bricks, and trainee masons, and the work came out splendidly. Since 1940, the monument has persevered the cold and hot weather. It has persevered the sunlight and the moonlight. It has persevered the long and short trains. It has been there for 82 years. It is only a very slight change has been noticed due to weathering. It is paramount to note that Mr. Carr was not buried in the memorial as many local people may believe. It is Reverend Dr. Clive Ivan who was buried here back in 1974, and the ashes of his wife Margaret Joyce, Mom, were brought from Britain and buried next to Dr. Ivan's grave. Geoffrey Ivan and his wife are also buried at the Carr Memorial Center. In 1997, the Presbytery of PCA Chogoria renovated and improved the memorial monument to preserve it for many years for the benefit of our future generation in honor of the Ivans and Carrs because of their great contribution and love for the Meru people while based in Chogoria. Clive Ivan Presbyterian Center was also initiated in marking 75 years anniversary Christian experience in Chogoria. Dr. Ivan brought the good news of Jesus Christ, served as a great medical doctor, church minister, educationist, and administrator of enormous experience, and the father of the modern civilization in this area. The saying, "They are known by their actions," was well illustrated by the achievements of the departed friends who will be remembered for a very long time to come, and the region is very happy to be associated with their work in this area. The coffee. Originally, the colonial government in Kenya did not allow indigenous Africans to plant and own coffee trees as a cash crop. It was exclusively the domain of the white settlers who were well protected by the colonial laws. Around 1930, Dr. Clive Ivan identified the need for Africans to have income-generating projects and started praying seriously. He shared his vision with his wife Joyce, who helped him in prayers. Dr. Ivan had seen the need for the locals to have coffee in their farms as an investment project. This plant would also assist for the much-needed mission donations, offerings, tithings, taxes, and more so for own family use. Around 1932, Dr. Ivan wrote to the governor requesting permission for Africans in Chogoria Mission and Meru as a whole to plant and own coffee. As the matter had to go through all government machineries, it was later decided that the permission be granted to Dr. Ivan himself. He pressed on until 1935 when Africans were allowed to do coffee farming. He did this very cautiously and his prayers answered. He planted his own for experiment and in great joy he slaughtered a he-goat to celebrate. The goat was eaten at Kibugua in Magumoni. The natives were gathered by Dr. Ivan and explained the need to plant coffee as a cash crop and the benefits therein. Originally, a few people agreed, although hesitating, and among them were James Maiti, Joseph Mtuarachi, Jackson Nkuri, Josiah Mtuamantu, and Stephen Mtuarerwa. The coffee plant did extremely well and the first coffee factory was established at Chirigwa, Chogoria, Kamara, and later in the entire Meru area. Coffee growing in the large Meru is one of the backbones of economy. It was the coffee industry that became a major economic force in Meru, enabling many people to pay for school fees, hospital fees, and also taxes. Education sector grew up from economy of coffee. Church donations and offerings increased for the glory of God. The church. It was in June 1923 that a small church building was erected, built of mud and wattle for walls and grass thatched roof. It served as a sanctuary on Sunday and a rudimentary school during the days of the week. As the congregation grew, the first baptismal service was conducted in the church on 28 September 1923. Mrs. Marion Musa Baibere was among the first women to be baptized. In March 1926, the first African minister was posted to Chogoria from Tumutumu in the person of Reverend Jeremiah Waita, who worked until 1928 when he was replaced by Reverend Solomon Dambi. On 4th August 1928, Mrs. Ernest laid the foundation stone of a new church. The church, built of bricks, was completed and dedicated on Friday 17th January 1930. It was built at a cost of 1,000 euros, received through donations from the Church of Scotland and other friends of Chogoria. In 1931, Chogoria Congregation was formed as a further step in the growth of the church. In 1932, 4th of February, Dr. Arthur ordained the first African elders of the church from Chogoria, namely Willie Kanini, Musa Mutwamuga, Jerishom Mukangu, and Jonathan Mutwamurithi, who were chosen from among the then senior deacons of the congregation. It is in the same year that Dr. Clive Ivan was ordained as a minister of word and sacrament by the Church of Scotland due to his special qualifications and dedication to his work. The converts. Around 1926, the number of converts had increased tremendously under the Reverend Dr. J.W. Arthur. Some of the first converts to Christianity were William Mtwanjau, Ernest Kaithungu, Mwalimu Justo, Jackson Nkuri, Marion Musa, Daudi Mtwararia, Jonathan Mtwantiba, Johnston Mtwakiambati, Musa Mtwamuga, Jerishom Mukangu, Zakayo Kirika, Yusufu Micheu, and Simon Kamuru. Josiah Mtwamantu, then very young, witnessed these events. Mr. Daudi Mtwaraira was the first African to marry in the church at Chogoria in 1927. In 1928, Dr. Clive Evans started an outstation at Kambu in Mudambi, where some of the first scholars and converts in Mudambi included Gideon Mutwadhura, Ruben Mukatha, Amos Muyandi, Naftali Mtwamuga, Robinson Nkuria, Stanley Rudhiri, Jason Mukangu, Utunga Kirimania, Jonah Kirimania, Jeremiah Mtwabore, and Benjamin Karaya. Another outstation was opened at Kiamuchumbi, attracting people like Johanna Mtwantiba, Yusuf Mungori, Musa Mtwabundi, Zakaria Mtwakiija, Philip Mukobwa, Shadrach Ngajiu, Harun Mtwaidhara, and Johnson Mtwamukiria. The mission grew. Chogoria grew large and bounds. There was explosion of visitors. Some were coming to visit Clive Evan or staff or even students. And with church growth, there grew other needs. Some needs included the creation of outstations, schools, churches, and clinics. Some staffs were relocated from Chogoria Mission. New centers were planted at Idhimbari, Kamwimbi, Mukuuni, Njuri, Kambandi, Kireni, Dagani, Kidhagani, Tungu, Ngeru, Gitundu, Gikurune, Gatuntune, Kajampao, Kanyakine, Rubate, Maituni, Kirindini, Kajunduthi, Katharaka, among others. Those centers were called bush outstations. Students used them as schools, while communities near them used them as public baraza, meeting centers, clinics, and worship centers. With this, there arose demands for ordained ministers. This is because Chogoria for a very long time was getting services of the ministers who were sent from Tumutumu and Kikuyu mission stations. The regular ones were Dr. Arthur from Kikuyu, Dr. Philip, and Calderwood from Tumutumu. The Methodist mission had no ordained minister. They relied on Tumutumu and Kikuyu stations. Traveling to Chukamwimbi and Kaga stations was not easy. In March 1926, Reverend Jeremiah Waita from Tumutumu was posted to Chogoria, and on 4th April 1926, the first Holy Communion was administered. The numbers in the church and in the Holy Communion attendance increased. The Reverend Jeremiah Waita made a program to be visiting churches across the outstations. The cash offering was very low and Christians preferred to offer food items. With the intensive pastoral programs of Reverend Waita, the first Christian marriage at Chogoria was established in 1927 between Daudi Mtwararia and his wife. Following that colorful wedding ceremony, 24 married couples came forward to have their marriage blessed in the church. In 1928, Reverend Jeremiah left Chogoria and was replaced by Reverend Solomon Dambi. Reverend Dambi was another charismatic minister just like Waita. In August the same year, Reverend Dambi appointed 7 deacons. He formed the first deacon corps to take administrative and financial services of the church. The first bunch of deacons were Ayubu, teacher, Filippo, evangelist, Gershom, evangelist, Musa, the first Christian to be baptized by Dr. Arthur in September 1924, Jonathan, evangelist, Maina, stone mason, Daudi, teacher, Justo and Willie, evangelist. On that same day, Mrs. Ernest Carr laid the foundation stone of the new church to be built by bricks to replace the original mud and wattle structure of 1923, which was now falling into disrepair due to white ants, kidhuya and weather. White ants were a menace. The new church was constructed in a record less than 1.5 years, and on 17th January 1930, the church was dedicated by Reverend R.G.M. Calderwood. The Women's Guild was formed by Reverend Robert McPherson in August. This opened the door to the Ministry of Women in Chogoria. Chogoria annual booklet was launched. It was produced by Dr. Ivan. The education, activities, and impact. The education is a major pillar in Presbyterianism. The CSM carried this pillar with them from Europe to Kikuyu to Tumutumu to this our land. Their education was formal, unlike the one of the Ameru. The Ameru form of education was largely informal. The Church of Scotland Mission introduced literacy and technical form of education. After the arrival of Dr. Clive Ivan, Sir Ernest Carr and Sir A.R. Barrow built a workshop and an industry that was helped to build up a mission station in Chogoria. With that in vision, a rudimentary school was started. Technical classes were conducted during the weekdays. The first teacher was called Mr. Maina. He was a mason from Tumutumu. His main class was training in the mason and making of the bricks. Ayub Nguaya was also brought in. He was a carpenter from Tumutumu Station and he was a very good trainer. These two helped catechments with skills and expertise in building and construction. The Walter Structural Church of 1923 was constructed by the trainees. Reverend Dr. Arthur was so impressed by the artisans of Chogoria that some were qualified and transferred to Kikuyu Mission Station to build the wards. On their return home in 1926, they were promoted and became the supervisors and senior officers who oversaw the expansion of the mission in the construction of outstations and bush schools. The CMS Chogoria Station decided to open up outstation schools across the Chuka Mwimbi mission zone. These outstation schools served as A. Preaching stations on Sundays and the days of prayers, B. Catechism classes in between the week, C. Technical training institutes in the afternoon on weekdays, D. Arithmetic classes in the morning sections on weekdays, E. Meeting halls on Saturdays and Sunday afternoons. By 1929, there were 15 outstation schools across this region. These were Kioreni, Mukuni, Weru, Tungu, Ngeru, Kirindini, Idhimbani, Kanyakine, Kajiunduthi, Nkuthika, Njuri, Kituntu, Goji, Gakuni, and Egangara. Many people were converted to Christianity through the outstation missionary work. Many got assimilated to the Western form of education and lifestyle. These who furthered education through Church of Scotland Mission furthered the cause of the missionaries to the local community. They discouraged their fellow community members from continuing with practices that were not compatible with the new found gospel. According to Muita, hewn from the Query, 2003, the CSM desire was to exploit talents, abilities, and qualities of the gifted Africans. Thus, those who got employed through CMS Chogoria Station were well trained in their fields of specializations. The technicians, the medics, the evangelists, and teachers enhanced growth and development in this area. The colonial government easily acquired managers, officers, and workers whenever opportunities arose. This area developed greatly. Farming developed, education developed, health developed. Church grew rapidly despite the many disruptions that faced this area. Those who graduated from the mission schools were employed in all sections of life. Just to mention a few is health, education, politics, constructions, business, agriculture, and government officers. After Kenya attaining independence, African officers were posted all over. Some found themselves in Marsabit, Moyale, Isiolo, Nanyuki, Meru, Maua, Kubu, Runyenjes, and Embu. Those that were Presbyterians traveled with their church. They gathered themselves together, they acquired lands, they built PCA churches, schools, clinics, and other social projects that have been impacted so greatly to the neighborhood. They evangelized to the locals, and that is how the PCA found roots in areas that missionaries had not been able to reach out. From the beginning, Presbyterians, previously the Church of Scotland Mission, has been so much concerned with educational development. It has distinguished itself well with enhancement of human education and human development. The schools and colleges have been assisted to grow. Teachers and other professionals have been trained, and that is why majority of academic giants from these regions have been schooled in Presbyterian schools or taught by Presbyterian teachers. These academic giants are past, present, and future policy makers on matters of national and international importance. The hospital, health activities and impact. The medical work began in 1923 in 4 little mud and wattle huts. One served as the operating theatre, one served as an injection room, one served as the dressing room, and one served as hospital store. Later, a small dispensary cum operating theatre of brick was built. This enhanced the health of the people who owned the mission. The mission station expanded its health services and activities throughout the station schools. Thus, the Chuka Mwimbi Mission Hospital increased the specialization in outpatient services. Initially, many patients were unwilling to stay overnight in the hospital or in the outstation centers. But by 1925, the medical services of the mission hospital had greatly increased. Some patients were traveling as far as Ukambani, Embu, and Tigania. Due to distance and necessity, Chogore Hospital opened inpatient services. In April 1925, Dr. Ivan, with the generous assistance of Sir Ernest Carr, began to build the first permanent hospital building. It was built of brick, 2 large wards, a spacious consulting room, a large dispensary, an operating room, a bathroom, and a blanket store. He also constructed a home for leprosy patients. By 1928, Mwimbi people did no longer fear admission in the new hospital. The hospital had recorded 159 theatre operations by 1929, majority of them being Indians. The principal communicable diseases in Meru were leprosy, yaws, tuberculosis, tick-borne repulsing fever, and malaria. There were many wounds and injuries treatment due to men falling out of trees or being attacked by the wild animals. Between 1923 and 1929, very many women were brought to the hospital bleeding, occasioned by FGM, and the hospital was of great assistance. Up to until 1950, Dr. Ivan was the trainer of the hospital staff. He was a great trainer, but in 1950, the colonial government introduced a syllabus for different hospital staff. In 1951, Dr. Ivan applied for recognition of a training school. He was allowed, and Chogoria Mission Hospital became a center for training nurses, clinical officers, and medical doctors who would in turn work in the government hospitals in Embu, Kerugoya, Nyeri, and Meru. The first class started with 6 girls and 2 boys. The students' color for the uniform was white with trimmed green, and the trained medical staffs were white with trimmed red. Since then, the nursing school has remained, but the other trainings were transferred to the government facilities. The nursing school was later to be renamed Clive Ivan School of Nursing. It is the best even today. By 1968, they saw a need to build a modern hospital with modern apparatus. A fundraising was held. The chief guest was the then head of state, the late Mzee Jomo Kenyatta, assisted by the then provincial commissioner Eliud Mahihu and the German government. The modern hospital was built and completed in 1971. Mzee Jomo Kenyatta opened the new hospital, and the presbytery moderator then, the Reverend Elias Kabii, dedicated the whole new hospital buildings. The need arose to open outreach clinic services to reach more patients who were terminally ill or were working from long distance to Chogoria. A community health center was established to cater for all relevant needs of the outreach care. However, the center is currently offering outpatient services because most of the outreach clinics were taken over by the community management. Further, the hospital has continued to expand its clinic work. We have a clinic at Chuka Town. We have a dental unit, comprehensive care center, kidney center, CT and MRI center, pastoral chaplaincy, several theaters, and modern hostels, among others. The periods of disruptions. Female genital mutilation controversy. Female genital mutilation (FGM) was a discussion and controversy around 1929 and thereafter. As a young mission, Chogoria suffered a great deal of disruption on the growth of Christian faith, Christian experience, and the missionary work. The Presbyterians at Kikuyu, Tumutumu, and Chogoria prepared Promise, the famous Kirore. It was not desired by many, and this therefore caused a schism. This was a moment that many Africans, especially from Kikuyu land, were rebelling from the Western missionary-oriented culture. There was a growing negative attitude from the Africans towards the European programs in Kenya, particularly in Kikuyu land. The Meru people were incited to question the newfound custom against the fast-fading African, which they had dropped before becoming Christians. One of them was on sexuality that was divided into several sections. There was the issue of the polygamy against monogamy. There was the issue of sexually motivated dances. There was also the issue of circumcision of women and the girls. The third one was the bone of contest here. Therefore, it became a controversy. The controversy was later to be described by the medical doctors of the CSM in the 3 stations as FGM. They called it a vice and not a virtue, as Africans Meru wanted it called. The medics did a lot of research and realized that a lady who had gone through FGM produced very undesirable effects, especially during childbirth. Sometimes it resulted even to the death of the mother and the child. Thus, a ruling was done countrywide that FGM is illegal through the Alliance of Churches. CSM doctors and hospital staff became conscious of these undesirable effects. This is recorded by H.R.A. Philip, Native Gynecology, 1924. The education against it was introduced in all the preaching stations of Chogoria Mission and in Chogoria Hospital. The girls who attended schools, education, health, catechism, and preaching at the outstations were well taught about the negative impact of FGM vis-a-vis a healthy living. They were taught about modern health and modern medicine. Miss Marion Stevenson, a teacher and school inspector of curriculum in all the CSM schools, also introduced this knowledge, education in the schools. She actually preferred to call this custom as sexually mutilation. Geneva, WHO, 1993. The research and discussion work was made for a long period of time. Then a rule was made on 20th September 1929 to outlaw the women circumcision among the CSM Christians. It was made and signed at Chogoria Church in a meeting that was attended by over 500 members across the country and across different missionary enterprises. In the Church of Scotland Mission, it was implemented immediately as a church law. Here below are some of the leaders and prominent Christians who signed the promise, thumbprint, to ascertain their loyalty and Christian stand on 20th September 1929 at the Chogoria Church. Reverend Solomon Dambi, the minister in charge, Dr. Clive Ivan, Reverend Dr. Arthur, Elijah Wambu, Willie Kanini, Johanna, Wilson Maweru, Mr. and Mrs. Jonathan, Musa Mutuamuga, Gideon Mutuadhura, Naftali Mutuamuga, Solomon Kagema, Gerishom Mukangu, Faris Mutunga, Philip Mutuadhura, Richard Kivuata, Samson Maingi, Murungi, Samson Joroge, Samuel Gitau, Ernest Kamau, Arthur Rucha, Amos Mukara, Ayub Mugo, Kanyua Mtuarachi, Murai Waireri, Jonathan Murianki, and over 450 others. This service and ceremony was conducted by Reverend Dr. Arthur in the presence of A.R. Barlow, Marion Stevenson, and Reverend Solomon Dambi, who was the minister at that time. At this time, the mission was young, 7 years of age, and the population was not very big. The membership was about 700, including staff in the mission. The implementation of the rule faced resentment from those who were not very deeply rooted in faith. Several left the mission faith, and this hampered the zeal of mission establishment. But despite this disruption, the mission continued to charge its duties as mandated in the Word of God. The Kikuyu Central Association propaganda in 1930s up to 1960. The Kikuyu Central Association, KCA, was an African association that was created to fight against the European incursion in Kenya. The association formed propaganda and incited Africans all over central Kenya to turn against anything associated with the Europeans. Christian and non-Christians in Meru were intimidated and harassed to be watchful of the European and the civilization. They warned the locals that their land will be stolen, that the education African will be destroyed, that the African medicine is getting cursed. Many of the locals got troubled, and so many candidates for baptism refused to take the vow related with the FGM. This caused a lot of delays to getting people to baptize. This hampered and delayed the process to the full membership. It as well delayed in getting to be joined in church wedding, Christian marriages. Due to these confusions and disruptions, many left CSM to the independent church and the Roman Catholic mission at that time, because in those churches there were no strict rules to be followed to become accepted in the church full status. Those who were left in the CMS continued to pray and to encourage one another in faith. By God's grace, there came the revival at Rwanda and Uganda. Reverend Dr. Clive Ivan invited the revivalists at Chogoria. Miss Mary Mowat, Silas Muchina, Dedan Wangai, and Rachel Wangai became a beacon of hope for the mission. They organized conventions and open-air preaching, and very many people either returned in the church, many others joined the CMS church. It is the revival in the 1940s that things changed for the the better to the missionary work and God's work through the CSM. God's work continued to grow, and the big mind of Reverend Dr. Arthur and the other early missionaries kept growing and glowing. Second World War. The negative effects. Another disruption to the mission progress was the Second World War. The Ameru people occupied the present land, the land they called their country, way back after the myth on migration. They never left their land unoccupied to this day. Meru land is rarely hit by calamities unlike the ones of the Kikuyus. The weather is always fine with minimal disasters such as diseases and landslides. The colonial government conscripted our people to join in the World War. One of the negative effects of the World War is that our people learned that European people did not love one another as they had always been made to believe. The missionaries had always taught about love as implied in the Bible, though back in their land, they hated and killed each other. All this happened in the eyes of the conscripted Africans. After return from the warfield, the survivors brought a very bad report about the European. This forced the fellow Africans to disrespect the white man, whether a missionary or not. So as long as your color is white, they became a mockery and a disgrace, and this caused some disillusionment and disruptions of the mission work. Some Africans demanded to take over self-rule, to take over back their former cultural practices and their own lands. This did not spare the mission and the missionary work. Chogoria mission was not in isolation and was not exceptional. We suffered the external effects. Programs of the mission station and outsessions were frequently disrupted. These effects were caused by external world, but they affected the internal running and operation of the mission station. Dr. Clive Evan, a man full of prayers, accompanied by his wife, Joyce, set section of their lives in prayers. They also involved staff and all people in prayers. He even wrote a book called Telephone to Heaven. And because of his prayer life, Chogoria remained exceptional. Even today, PCA Eastern Region is a very unique mission. The people and mission work were preserved by the prayers. Slowly by slowly, the mission work regained growth. The church in Eastern Region is godly and calm even when it is hot in the other regions of the PCA. It is the only place in Kenya that has never been involved in tribal clashes and post-election crisis. Just try to compare Chogoria with other mission stations. Chogoria is just unique. This is because people here were brought up with a lot of godliness by the founders of Presbyterianism. The people are just amazing and unique and have a unique culture. The Mau Mau Uprising. The period between 1950 and 1957 was a very hard and painful one for the Chogoria mission. The churches, the hospital, the clinics, and the schools faced the worst enemy in this region. On one hand, it was a time of education, great loss. Schools associated with CSM were targets of being burnt down. Teachers were killed and murdered. Their houses were torched. Learners were disillusioned. Schools were closed, and many activities aimed at being proponent to CSM were treated as an enemy of the Mau Mau. Health attendance to hospital or outstation clinics were halved. Many patients died at home for fear of Mau Mau activities and reactions, if they were found seeking medical attention in CSM centers. Many families of the patients who sought medical assistance at CMS hospital or outstation clinics feared social stigma. Very many outstation churches associated with CSM were torched, burnt down. Those that mainly suffered were Mikwani, Makawani, Nkudhika, Kambandi, Kabate, Tungu, Kombu, Ngeru, Gangara, Igoji, among many others. They were burnt down. A lot of church properties were destroyed and people were stopped from going to church. Period of recovery. The revival. On the other hand, the big mind kept growing from worse to better. Those challenges did not deter the zeal of the church. The church reinvented its wheels and started all over again. In the years of 1955 to 1960, PCA doubled its number of schools, its numbers of church membership, its economical capital, and church faithfulness. There was a great revival. There was a great relationship among Christians. The revival meetings conducted by a team led by Sister Mary Mowat and evangelists Silas Muchina, Dedan Wangai, and Rachel Wangai revived the lives of the people. The community that was once disillusioned by the Mau Mau uprising was strengthened. Christians built many schools across the Chogoria mission sphere of influence. Mwalimu Mariamu Ndango wa Samuel led many Christians into a life of holiness and godliness, to live a life of purity. She and her groups of serious women Christians were targeted for oathing by the Mau Mau sympathizers and militia. They refused to take the oath and gave their lives as sacrifice. Mwalimu Mariam Dango wa Samueli was killed on 11th April 1954 because of her faith by Mau Mau loyalists for refusing to take Mau Mau oath. She died as a martyr. Her body was buried at Chogoria Church graveyard. With her death came a great revival. Many desired to join her faith. Her death became a fire that burnt many across the lower Meru. The martyrdom of Mariamu gave the rebirth of revival. It increased a great desire to life of holiness and righteousness. The population of PCA increased. Many churches were planted, and by 1960, CSM had 155 churches across Chogoria Mission. Many women desired to become teachers. Many children, especially girls, desired to go to school and learn more. Thus, the death of Mariamu Ndago was a rebirth, and it brought a new zeal to development and growth of churches, schools, and dispensaries by the PCA. People received a new power to love God. It is reported in the minutes of the board of the church that offerings increased by triple from 1955, and in 1960, the other two mission stations, Kuyen to Tumutumu, came to do a benchmarking because Chogoria Mission was paying its staff on time. That the salary of coming next year was always in the bank by the beginning of this year. Skillfully, this made the General Assembly in 1966 to resolve to centralize the salaries of its staff. Before this, staffs in the mission stations were receiving their salaries at their working stations. That is, all professional staff, for there were volunteer staff. This is how the salaries were centralized. The church staff in church offices, schools, and hospitals started to receive salaries from the head office, General Assembly offices. However, it did not last long. In 1968, the parliament made a session paper and all mission schools were taken over by the government of Kenya. Teachers from then on became government staff. Salaries of staff of Chogoria Hospital were decentralized. In 2003, salaries of other church workers were also decentralized. Towards independence. This was a period of Kenyans were agitating for independence from the colonial masters. People were living in villages with 50 to 500 huts. Teachers had easy time in enhancing missionary education since there was a provided security. Evangelists had easy time in enhancing Christian faith. Medical personnel had easy time in enhancing health. Extension officers had an easy time as well. Villagization was a great advantage. Children had easier time together for learning and training. People were no longer miles apart. There was very little fear for security. Learners of vocational training and the 3 R's did not get tired to and from school. Supervision of education, health, and evangelism was also made easy. According to Siambaka, 1993, there were over 5,000 pupils in PCA-run schools with over 130 teachers in 1956 in the whole of Chogoria Mission Station. All villages and the villages were well guarded under heavy guards. In 1958, a state of emergency was degazetted. People started to move back from villages to their former farms. Others established farms further to the forest and settled there. And due to distance, more schools were started, more dispensaries opened, more churches were started, more teachers were employed, more health personnel were trained and hired, and more evangelists were recruited to take care of the new norm of life for the scattered population. In 1960, the mode of education changed from vocational training for the locals who were average to both technical and literacy for all. The technical mode, though retained, it was not highly valued. Many preferred the literacy and arithmetic, thus becoming the most embraced by all, from the lowest to the highest IQ levels. Significant historical data. The most significant dates and data for Chogoria Mission. 1913. The land of Meru, between Kidhino River and Thuchi River, is identified by Reverend Dr. Arthur J.W. as a virgin land that Church of Scotland should plant the seed of the gospel and make a sphere of influence. 1914. Church voted to accept to sponsor missionary work in Lower South Meru, Kenya colony. 1915. 6 African evangelists from Tumutumu and Kikuyu mission stations were dispatched as for runners of the European missionaries to prepare the ground, but the work was hampered and disrupted by the First World War, 1915 to 1918. 1920. Chogoria gained acceptance as the best site to build a mission station. Reverend Dr. Arthur declared Chogoria as the place is a beautiful green sward. 1921. Dr. Clive Evan volunteered himself and his family to come and build up the missionary work and station. Sir Ernest Carr accepted a request from the Church of Scotland to lay the foundation work for the mission station. Accompanied by A.R. Barlow, they drew all necessary plans and documents for the mission and station, including compensation for the landowners. The site got vacated. 1922. The missionary bungalow got erected on 9th October 1922 at 5:30 p.m. East African time. Dr. Clive Evan with a team arrived in Chogoria, spent the night in the bungalow, and began to build the mission and the ministry. On 17th October 1922, Daudi Makumi, his wife Priscilla, and their 3 children left their home to join Dr. Clive Ivan. The family arrived in Chogoria on 20th October 1922. They got hosted at the bungalow for 3 months, waiting for their house to be completed. A workshop and a hospital were erected. The hospital became operational on 12th December 1922. 1923, the first small church was erected. It was built of mud and wattle for the wall and grass thatched for the roof. 1924, the first baptism of 12 men and 1 woman, Marion, got conducted at Chogoria. 4 more African evangelists arrived from Tumutumu, though their names are missing in the initial record. 1927, the first wedding ceremony was held in Chogoria in the old wattle-built church. Daudi Mtwariaria was the first person to hold a church wedding in Chogoria. 1928, the first deacon court was formed, comprising of Reverend S. Ndambi, minister, Dr. Clive Evan, missionary, Filippo, Musa, Maina, Gerishom, Willie, Jonathan, and Ayub. Ernest Carr sponsorship deed for sponsoring the CSM missionary work in Chogoria got expired, never to be renewed again. A register was prepared for followers and staff to make subscription in order to sustain the ministry in the mission. Mrs. Loisa Carr, the wife to Ernest Carr, laid the foundation stone for the permanent church building of brick, since termites were a menace in the area. 1929, anti-FGM declaration was made, popularly known as Kirore. The promise was made with a thumbprint form of signing. Those who were opposed to it walked out of the church, and their leader was Johnston Kiambati. 1930, opening and dedication of the modern church that was built of bricks and roofing sheet was done by Reverend R.G.M. Calderwood. Evangelism got enhanced by the hospital and school staff. This increased the church attendance. 1932, ordination of the first African church elders from Chogoria Mission was done. It was conducted by Reverend Dr. Arthur, assisted by Reverend Solomon Ndambi. The church elders were Willie Kanini, Musa Mutwamuga, Gerishom Mukanga, Jonathan Murithi, Ayubu, Daudi Mtwararia, Jonathan Murianki. Chogoria Succession was formed under the Presbytery of Kenya. Geographically, Chogoria Parish was from River Kidhino to River Tuchi. 1933, Dr. Clive Evan was ordained as a church minister in Aberdeen, Scotland, to serve in Chogoria Parish. 1935, Africans in Chogoria Parish got the permit to grow coffee. The goat-eating ceremony was held at Kibugwa in Chuka, and coffee became the backbone of economy in the larger Meru. 1940, the Presbytery of Tumutumu was created and Chogoria Parish was placed under Tumutumu Presbytery. The Synod of East Africa as the Supreme Court of the Church in Kenya was formed. The ceremony was conducted at Tumutumu Church. Chogoria Parish sent a delegation of 151 people, and they were hosted by the Christians of Tumutumu in their homes for 4 days. 1943, Chogoria Church hosted the ordination of Reverend Joseph Gadoga. Though from Tumutumu, the Reverend Gadoga had lived in Chogoria for almost 20 years as an evangelist and a teacher. Therefore, he was seen very much like a Chogoria person. 1944, the first East African Revival Convention was held at Kanyakine, Chogoria and Chuka concurrently for 5 days. The facilitators were 2 Europeans and 6 Africans, namely Miss Mowat, Reverend J.N. Duncan, Jedel Micheu, Silas Muchina, Abednego Kamunga, Junius Munywa, Teresia, and Jessica. 1947, Chogoria Parish held a Silver Jubilee 25 years anniversary. This attracted a mammoth crowd of over 5,000 people from even other churches in entire Meru, from Embu, Kirinyaga, Tumutumu, and Scotland. 1949, a New Year service was held and the Reverend Dr. Clive Evan was the preacher. He prophesied it was a year of great revival. In June, Silas Muchina was relieved of his ordinary duties to concentrate on the revival work. He traversed across Meru, Kenya, and beyond in East Africa. In 1950, PCA Weru and Kanyakine churches were dedicated. 1951, the church relieved Mwalimu Bernard Mate, the first African principal of Chogoria Junior Secondary School, to go to Wales, England for further studies. 1952, Jedel Micheu is ordained as the church minister, becoming the first Meru minister in the CSM to be ordained. The first one from Meru descent. Chuka Parish and succession is formed by the Presbytery of Tumutumu and Reverend Jedel Micheu becoming the first parish minister. The parish headquarters were laid at Kiereni. 1953, the succession and the parish of South Meru is formed. The Presbytery of Chogoria is formed, having been hived from the Presbytery of Tumutumu. The Reverend Dr. Clive Ivan was elected the Presbytery Moderator, and the Reverend Jediel Micheu was elected Presbytery Clerk. All these ceremonies were conducted at Kanyakine and were conducted by the Presbytery of Tumutumu. The presiding moderator was Reverend Charles Muhoho Kareri. Internal transfers of ministers were done as follows. Reverend Jediel Micheu was made the minister of Chogoria Parish. Reverend Geoffrey Ngari becoming the parish minister of Chuka, and Reverend Lenas Waruiru becoming the parish minister of South Meru. The Reverend Dr. Clive Ivan was made to concentrate on the hospital duties, though being the Presbytery moderator for 6 years. The main three evangelists for the three parochial zones were Faris Mutunga for Chogoria, Silas Muchina for Chuka, and Willie Kanini for South Meru. 1954. The state of emergency is declared in Kenya due to Mau Mau insurgency activities, and the missionary activities in Chogoria slowed down. There was a disruption everywhere. Mwalimu Mariam Dago for Samuel is martyred by Mau Mau loyalists for refusing to take the Mau Mau oath, and the church was silenced for almost an year. Many churches, schools, and clinics in the outstations were burnt down. 1961. Reverend Dr. Clive Ivan and his wife Joyce retired from Chogoria Mission and went to live in Nairobi. 1962. Chogoria School opened the doors for Form 1 class, Boys High School. 1964. Chogoria School opened the door for Form 1 class, Girls High School, and later closed. An inspired young teacher by the name Charity Kari Julius boldly moved from one office to another for the restarting of the girls' school at Chogoria, and the permission was granted in 1968. 1965. Reverend Linus Warui died in a road accident, and his death was great shock to the Church of South Meru, where he had worked so well, having planted over 26 churches. He was in the process of combining the Catholic parish that was under Father Layhard to the parish of South Meru. 1968. Girls High School under the headship of Mrs. Charity Kari Julius was started for a second chance, and it sprang up so well and is now the prestigious National Schools for Girls. 12 women were ordained as church leaders, breaking the ground for the women to serve at the highest level of Presbyterianism. 1969. Renovation of the hospital started. A fundraising was held, championed by the late elder and provincial commissioner Eliud Mahihu. A record was broken for that fundraising. It raised 1 million shillings. 1970. Mzee Jomo Kenyatta laid the foundation stone for the new hospital. 1971. Mzee Jomo Kenyatta opened phase 1 of the new hospital, and the Presbytery moderator Reverend Elias Kabi dedicated all the buildings in the new hospital. 1974. Reverend Dr. Clive Ivan died, and his ashes were buried at Chogoria Ernest Carr Memorial Monument. 1978. The parish of South Meru was divided into 3, giving back to Igoji, Kanyakine, and Ngirine parishes. The Presbytery of Imenti is created with its headquarters at Kanyakine. 1980. Mrs. Margaret Joyce Ivan died in England, and her ashes are buried at Chogoria Ernest Carr Memorial Monument next to her husband. 1984. Reverend Alfama K. Kinyua was ordained as a minister of word and sacrament, breaking the ground and creating the history in the ordination of women as church ministers. 1985. Completion of tamaking of Kadageri, Chuka, Chogoria, and Kubu Road with a side road extension to Chogoria Mission Station, opening Chogoria for the current civilization. 1988. Chuka Parish was divided into 3, giving birth to Magumoni, Kiereni, and Dagani. The Presbytery of Chuka was created with its headquarters at Njuri. The functions were presided over by the moderator of the 12th General Assembly, Right Reverend Dr. George Wanjau, SG Reverend Dr. Paulson Kuria, and DSG the Reverend Dr. Patrick Mungiriria. 1990. Board to spearhead Rebete Technical Training College is inaugurated by the GSC, and its chairman is Reverend Jediel Micheu. 1991. The Reverend Bernard Muindi is installed as moderator of PCA General Assembly, making history as the first Meru to hold that office. 1922. Chogoria Mission Station is placed under the new Tharakanithi district. Chogoria is also designated as an urban area, with Reverend Jediel Micheu becoming the first chairman of Chogoria Urban Council. 1993. Rubata Teacher Training College opened the doors for the PP1 teacher trainees. The first class had 37 students. 1997. Reverend Alfama K. Kinyua was elected Presbytery moderator of Chogoria, becoming the first lady minister to hold that office. 2005. Chogoria Presbytery was divided into 3 presbyteries, North, Central, and South. Imenti Presbytery was divided into 3 presbyteries, North, Central, and South. Chuka Presbytery was divided into 2 presbyteries, Chuka and Magumoni. 2012. Chogoria Central Parish was divided into 2 presbyteries, Central and West. Chogoria Township. Chogoria started as a small Christian mission station by a group of Scottish missionaries of the Church of Scotland and some other European business people around 1922. Chogoria for a long time was associated with the hospital as there was no trading center nearby. A small trading center had been started at Kabeche, 1 kilometer away, and served the school and hospital for a long time. Other trading centers were started along the Meru-Embu Road as the mission continued to grow, attracting visitors and settlers. With the growing of the mission station, there was growth of schools, churches, agro-farming, and tourism attraction sites and sceneries. Chogoria grew from a small non-mission station to township, with fast-growing trading centers. Administrative headquarters emerged. There was growth of Kibugua, Kiureni, Ndagani, Midheru, Marima, Kara, Mweria, Kiganguru, Kiria, Igoji, Kanyakine, and Kubu. In those administrative centers, assistant chiefs, district officers, district commissioners, and security officers. Chogoria was located under the administrative division of Kiganguru in 1991 and under the new Tharakanithi district. It was also given the status of the township council. The first chairman of the town council was the late Reverend Honorable Jedel Misheu. Soon after, it was elevated to the status of urban council and the offices were built up at Kirurumwe, Chogoria Junction. Chogoria was made the center of PCA Eastern Region and the seat of Chogoria Presbytery at the center of the mission station around 1985. In the same year, Chogoria was connected with Nairobi by 140-kilometer all-weather tarmac road. There was an automatic telephone exchange (STD) post office and electricity was made available. Chogoria established a small water supply system for the hospital and the institutions. The government supplied local community with a separate system from Mount Kenya Forest. Chogoria Mission is only 30 kilometers to the mountain. Tourists frequent the town on their way to climb the mountain from the eastern Chogoria route. The land is the one occupied by Chogoria Hospital, Chogoria Boys and Girls High Schools, Chogoria Girls Boarding Primary School, Chogoria Complex Primary School, Chogoria North Presbytery, and the regional headquarters. Climatically, Eastern region is placed very well and the people surrounding are growers of small coffee, tea, cereals, fruits, tuber and dairy farming. Timber harvesting has been a major economic force for the locals. The region occupies both Tharakanithi and Meru counties.